What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Let's Go Show.
Today is going to be a super good episode, and we are still talking about courage.
Yep, kicking it off with another episode of Courage. As we found out last week, I am very courageous.
I think we all know what actually happened.
I don't know. I think your memory is foggy because I'm super brave. And we learned last week that it's really important to be brave, and especially in the face of like something that scares you or something that might be getting in between you and what God wants you to do.
Exactly. So it's kind of like admitting you're wrong, even if it hurts your ego a bit.
Okay, fine. Yes, fine. It scared me a little bit, okay? But as we learned last time, we can be encouraged in knowing that God is with us no matter what we face.
True. That's a very good point. And actually today we're going to discuss how we can have courage when we know that God is bigger than our problems.
To that point, Carson, let me ask you, have you ever been an underdog? Like, has there ever been a time where, you were like disadvantaged?
Yeah, I'm sure. Maybe, during sports or maybe on a test at school, there have been, plenty of times where I felt like I was kind of at a disadvantage. But when I actually tried, I kind of did pretty well.
Those are always the best moments. That's the stuff movies are made of,
Yeah.
So what about you guys? Has there ever been like a time where you felt like an underdog? Let's talk about it.
So here's the thing. I've flown before, but if I can be honest, it still makes me really nervous. I know that it's the fastest way to travel, but still, right before I get on the plane, I'll start double checking my luggage, and sometimes I'll look at the plane and think, is it even big enough? But then I remember that everything is gonna be fine. But that's the thing about courage. You can't have it unless there's some fear. Let me explain. Take a look at Moses in the Bible. In Exodus chapter 3, God tells Moses to go and to free the Israelites. God tells him that if he talks to the people in God's name, that they're gonna listen. But Moses gets really scared when he thinks about having to speak to all of those people, which I totally understand because speaking in front of a lot of people can make me really nervous. In chapter 4, Moses says, what if they don't believe me? Or what if they don't listen to me? And even though God was with Moses, he was still scared and afraid of what God had asked him to do. And this is where Moses showed courage. He gathered all of his strength and all of his faith, and he did what God asked him to do. And that's what courage is. It's doing what God's asked you to do, even when you may be afraid. You can be courageous too. Just remember that God is with you. Deuteronomy 31:6 says, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them. For the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you.
Your line is. All right. This is ping pong shots.
That's something.
3-cup falafel. Oh yeah! Oh yeah!
This is Off the Wall.
This is the triple bounce splunk. This is corner cup. Challenge time, ping pong ball and cup splash. Let's go! 2-1. This is ping pong trick shots. No! Here, we got it.
God's story. Gideon. So part of God's story is about a man named Gideon, and it begins like this. Israel, God's special family, had turned against the one real God and worshipped idols. They had forgotten how God had loved and cared for them and needed a reminder that He was the one in charge. So God took away the Israelites' farms for 7 long years. Whenever the Israelites planted crops, God would let another nation called the Midianites sweep through and camp on Israel's land, ruining everything that was growing there. But even though his own family had forgotten him, God still loved them deeply. So, at the end of the 7 years, God appeared to a young Israelite named Gideon. God said he was going to free the Israelites with Gideon's help. Gideon, however, wasn't so sure, so he asked God to prove himself by performing a series of miracles. Gideon said, "If the fleece is wet with dew in the morning but the ground is dry, then I will know that you're going to help me rescue Israel as you promised." That's what happened. Just to be sure, the next night, Gideon asked God to do the opposite, make the fleece dry and make the ground wet. And God did it. Next, he even sent a sign through an angel. Gideon was finally convinced that God was in his corner, so he called together an army to fight against the Midianites. Now, normally having lots of people is a good thing when you're about to battle, but like I said, God does things a bit differently. He told Gideon that the Israelites had too many soldiers. If they won now, God knew the Israelites would say it was because of their own strength and brag about it. So, God wanted Gideon to have a smaller army. Gideon was nervous, but he did as God asked, which is always a good idea, by the way. He told his men that if they were afraid, they could return home. With that, 22,000 soldiers left, leaving Gideon with about 10,000. For you math whizzes, that's 2/3 of his army just poof, gone. Even after all that, the army was still too big. So God told Gideon to take the soldiers down to the water to drink, and then send home the soldiers who drank out of the stream like dogs. Again, Gideon did what God asked, and was now left with only 300 soldiers. God knew Gideon was probably worried, so he told him to sneak down to the enemy camp where Gideon heard soldiers talking about a crazy dream where a loaf of bread rolled into the Midianite camp and over their tent. One soldier said that could only mean that Gideon would triumph over them. Gideon returned to his own camp confident that he would win the battle. He divided his men into 3 groups and gave them each a trumpet and a jar with a torch inside. Not usually what you bring to a fight, but God had a plan. Gideon's army reached the edge of the Midianite camp and then went into action. They blew their trumpets, smashed their jars, and shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon!" And don't forget, they did all of this without a single weapon in their hands. Terrified, the Midianites fled, accidentally attacking each other as they went. In fact, they ran so far from the battlefield that other Israelites were able to capture and defeat the leaders of the Midianites. With the enemy leaders gone and their army running away, God had saved Israel, just like he said he would. And that's the story of Gideon. So, in case you missed it, here's the quick version. Israel turned away from God. God reminded them he was in charge. God said he would save Israel. He would use Gideon. God performed miracles for Gideon. Gideon gathered an army. God made it smaller. Much smaller. Soldiers had a dream. Gideon's army surprised their enemies. The Midianites ran away. God used Gideon to save Israel. And that's a part of God's story.
Man, the Bible is full of stories where God uses just ordinary people to show his extraordinary greatness.
Right? Like with Gideon, the odds just felt so stacked against him, but he knew that God was with him.
Yeah, and let's be honest, the Israelites weren't really at a good place. God wasn't pleased with them. They were disobeying God and doing really bad things, even though God had literally just freed them from captivity.
Right. It's like they forgot all the cool stuff that God had just done for them, you know?
Yeah, and to be honest, I think we can get that way sometimes. We get super complacent, and when we're faced with a problem or a situation that can be intimidating, we forget all that God has done for us in the past, and we try to be Superman and do it all on our own.
In the story, the Israelites are hiding because they're scared of the Midianites, and they're praying to God, please come deliver us.
Yeah, and this is where we find Gideon. He was faithful to God and looked to God for help. And you see, God wasn't done with his people. Even though they had to face the consequences of their disobedience, God still loved them and prepared to rescue them.
What's cool is that when the angel of the Lord came to Gideon, he called him a mighty warrior.
Yeah. And Gideon was like, bro, what? I'm like the weakest and the smallest in my family. How in the world am I supposed to save all these people?
Yeah, and the angel essentially tells him that even though he's small, like God is with him and that God is never too big for our problems.
Yeah, and we were also able to see how Gideon at times was still kind of nervous and afraid, but he chose to obey God and trust his word.
We saw how the story went. Like Gideon was the smallest and was terrified, but he knew that God was with him and God encouraged him and let him know that by God's power, Gideon would be able to defeat the Midianites.
Exactly, because sometimes we face big obstacles and we think that there's no way that we can overcome them. But just like Gideon, we can find courage when we know that God is bigger than our problems.
Exactly. And I think that we can learn from this is that God wants us to be faithful to him. That's all.
Exactly. And we don't have to be crazy strong or do some impossible thing by ourselves. We just have to trust God and rely on his strength.
Ultimately, he just wants us to put our faith in his son, Jesus. Jesus came to earth and essentially chose a group of underdogs. You know, they became his disciples and changed the world.
Exactly. And he died on a cross and defeated death so that now we can have a relationship with him.
For me, following Jesus was the best decision I ever made.
Exactly. And reminding myself of what God's done for me gives me courage and helps me to overcome any obstacle that I'll ever face.
Yeah, man. Real life sometimes makes you feel like you're Gideon.
Absolutely. No joke.
Yeah. Well, thanks for tuning in again, guys. This has been the Let's Go Show. We hope you guys tune in next week. Right,
Absolutely. See you guys.
Carson? Later.